The year was 1732, and the winter held the tidewater region of Virginia in its gray grip. In a modest plantation house along the Potomac River, a child was born into a world that did not yet know what he would become. The house was called Wakefield, though it would burn before the boy could form lasting memories of it. The land around it stretched quiet and cold, the river moving slowly past fields that lay dormant beneath February skies. His father was Augustine Washington, a man of moderate standing who owned land and slaves and harbored ambitions for his sons that outreached his own achievements. His mother was Mary Ball Washington, a woman whose strength would become legendary in its own quiet way, though not always kindly remembered. She was 23 when George was born, her first child with Augustine, though he had sons already from a previous marriage. The baby arrived on the 11th day of February by the old calendar, though later reckonings would shift his birth to the 22nd. Such adjustments of time would mark his era, as the world itself seemed to be recalibrating, finding new measures for the days. The Virginia into which George Washington emerged was a place suspended between wilderness and civilization, between the old world and something not yet fully imagined. The colony had existed for more than a century by then, but much of its interior remained unknown to the English families who clung to the rivers and the coast. The society they had built was based on tobacco, on land, on the labor of enslaved people brought across an ocean they would never recross. It was a world of rigid hierarchies, and yet also of possibility, where a man with land might rise, and where the lack of ancient titles meant that achievement and appearance could matter as much as birth. George's early years were spent in a landscape of red clay and green tobacco fields, of forests that seemed endless, of rivers that connected scattered plantations like veins through a living body. His father moved the family several times during those years, seeking better prospects, trying to establish his sons in advantageous positions. They lived at Wakefield, then at a place that would later be called Mount Vernon, then at Ferry Farm near Fredericksburg, where the boy would spend most of his youth. Each move was a small upheaval, a reminder that nothing was quite settled, that the family's position required constant maintenance and improvement. When George was 7 years old, his half-brother Lawrence returned from England, where he had been educated. Lawrence was 14 years older than George, and he arrived carrying with him the polish and promise of the wider world. He had been to school across the ocean. He spoke with a certain refinement. He represented everything that Augustine Washington hoped his sons might become. For young George, Lawrence became a figure of admiration and aspiration, a bridge to possibilities that seemed otherwise distant. But the plan for George's own education would never unfold as it had for Lawrence. When George was 11, his father died suddenly, leaving the family's fortunes divided and diminished. The boy's path to an English education disappeared with his father's last breath. Instead, he would remain in Virginia, receiving whatever schooling the local resources could provide. He learned to read and write adequately, though never with the fluency or classical learning that marked the truly educated gentleman of his time. He was taught enough arithmetic to keep accounts. He copied rules of civility from a manual, practicing penmanship and absorbing codes of behavior. He learned, above all, what he would need to know to manage land, to survey property, to make his way in a world where land was wealth and wealth was everything. The absence of formal education became one of those defining absences around which a character forms. George would always be conscious of what he lacked in learning, and this consciousness would make him careful, deliberate, slow to speak in the company of men he perceived as more refined. He would develop a formality, a reserve, a way of holding himself that could seem stiff or distant. He would never entirely shake the feeling that he was not quite the equal of those who had been to England, who read Latin, who moved easily through the world of ideas and letters. And yet this very absence would also shape his strengths, his attentiveness, his patience, his respect for those who possessed what he did not. His mother, Mary, kept him close. She was a forceful woman, exacting and difficult, or so many would later say. She wanted George to stay near, to help manage Ferry Farm, to remain within the orbit of her authority. When, at age 14, he sought to go to sea, hoping to join the Navy and find adventure and fortune, she refused. Whether her refusal was wisdom or selfishness or simply a mother's fear, it altered the course of his life entirely. Had he gone to sea, the story would have been altogether different. Instead, he remained on land, tied to the soil and rivers of Virginia, learning to know the country that would become his to defend and define. Lawrence had married well into the Fairfax family, one of the wealthiest and most influential in Virginia. Through Lawrence, young George gained entry into a world slightly above his own station. He visited Belvoir, the Fairfax estate, where he encountered a level of refinement and culture that both attracted and intimidated him. He met Lord Fairfax, an English nobleman who owned vast tracts of wilderness in the interior. He began to understand that opportunity lay not just in inheriting land, but in acquiring it, in moving westward into territories that were still being measured and mapped and claimed. At 16, George became a surveyor, learning to walk through forests with chain and compass, to mark boundaries, to translate wilderness into property. It was work that required physical endurance, mathematical precision, and a certain lonely independence. He traveled into the Shenandoah Valley and beyond, sleeping under trees or in rough shelters, encountering settlers and speculators and indigenous peoples whose own claims to the land were being steadily erased by the surveys he conducted. He learned the shape of the country, the flow of its rivers, the lie of its mountains. He learned what land was valuable and what was not. He learned to see the continent as something that could be possessed, divided, owned. The work was hard but profitable. He earned money. He began to buy land of his own, small parcels at first, then more. He was building something, step by step, an independence and a future. The surveying also taught him to endure discomfort, to lead small parties of men through difficult terrain, to make decisions in isolation. These were skills he did not yet know he would need, but they were forming him nonetheless, quietly and without announcement. In 1751, when George was 19, Lawrence fell ill with tuberculosis. The disease was wasting him slowly, and in desperation he decided to seek the warmth and healthful climate of Barbados. George accompanied him, the only time he would ever leave the North American continent. They sailed together, the dying older brother and the young man beginning to realize that the world was larger and more complex than Virginia had suggested. Barbados was hot and green and strange, a place where sugar and slavery created wealth on a scale that made Virginia seem modest. George contracted smallpox there, a mild case that left his face lightly scarred but granted him immunity to a disease that killed thousands. The scars would remain, and the immunity would matter years later, though he could not know it then. Lawrence did not improve. They returned to Virginia, and within months Lawrence died, leaving George heartbroken and also unexpectedly positioned to inherit Mount Vernon, the plantation that would become his home and his anchor for the rest of his life. He was 20 years old, and the man who had been his guide and model was gone. The inheritance would not be immediate, passing first to Lawrence's widow and then, upon her death, to George. But the prospect of it shaped his thinking, his choices, his ambitions. He began to seek military appointment, drawn perhaps by the same impulses that had once made him want to go to sea, the desire for honor and action and the recognition of men. Virginia was part of an empire, and that empire was in competition with other empires, particularly France, for control of the continent's interior. The frontier was not a line but a zone of contact and conflict, where French traders and soldiers, British colonists and speculators, and numerous indigenous nations pursued their own visions of the future. Young Washington presented himself to Governor Dinwiddie as a candidate for military service, and the governor, seeing in him the right combination of ambition and availability, sent him on a mission into the wilderness. It was late autumn of 1753, and Washington was 21. His task was to carry a message from the governor to the French commander in the Ohio country, warning the French to withdraw from lands claimed by Britain. It was a diplomatic errand, but also a reconnaissance, a chance to observe French strength and intentions. Washington set out with a small party, traveling north and west through forests and across rivers swollen with early winter rains. They moved through territories of the Seneca and other nations, and Washington met with leaders who were navigating their own complex relationships with the European powers. He delivered his message and received the French commander's polite refusal. The French would not withdraw. The journey back was harrowing, through ice and snow, and Washington nearly drowned crossing an icy river, saved only by his own strength and the loyalty of his companions. He returned and reported to the governor, and his account was published, making him briefly known throughout the colonies. He had succeeded in his mission, and he had demonstrated courage and determination. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel of the Virginia militia, and when tensions with France escalated into open conflict, he was sent back to the frontier with troops, tasked with building a fort and asserting British control. What followed was a series of events that revealed both his courage and his inexperience, his ambition and his capacity for miscalculation. In May of 1754, Washington led his men in a surprise attack on a French party, killing the French commander, Jumonville, and several others. Whether it was a legitimate military action or an ambush that violated diplomatic protocols remains debated, but it was Washington's first experience of violence, of giving orders that resulted in death. He later wrote to his brother that he had heard bullets whistle, and there was something charming in the sound. It was a young man's bravado, but it revealed something too, a hunger for glory, for the test of battle, for proof of his own worth. The French responded with force, and Washington found himself besieged at a hastily constructed stockade called Fort Necessity. After a day of fighting in the rain, outnumbered and with his men exhausted, he was forced to surrender. The terms allowed him and his men to withdraw, but the defeat was public and humiliating. He had been ambitious and rash, and he had failed. The experience marked him, teaching him lessons about pride and preparedness, about the limits of courage when not matched with resources and experience. He resigned his commission, stung by the politics of military rank and unwilling to serve under terms he considered demeaning. But the conflict between Britain and France was expanding into a wider war, and he could not remain apart for long. When General Edward Braddock arrived in Virginia in 1755 to lead a major expedition against the French, Washington volunteered to serve as an aide. Braddock was a professional soldier, trained in European warfare, confident in the superiority of British regulars over colonial militia or wilderness fighters. Washington admired him but also saw his limitations, his inability to adapt to the conditions of the American forest. The campaign ended in catastrophe. In July, as Braddock's army approached Fort Duquesne, they were ambushed by French and indigenous forces. The British regulars, trained to fight in open formations, were cut down in the tangled forest. Braddock was mortally wounded, and the army disintegrated into retreat. Washington, despite being ill with fever, displayed remarkable courage, riding back and forth through the gunfire, rallying troops, helping to organize the withdrawal. He had 2 horses shot from under him and found 4 bullet holes in his coat afterward, yet he emerged uninjured. The battle was a disaster, but Washington's conduct earned him widespread praise. He was brave under fire, calm in chaos, resilient in the face of defeat. In the aftermath, he was appointed commander of the Virginia militia, responsible for defending the colony's long and vulnerable frontier. He was 23 years old, in charge of several hundred men, facing an impossible task. The frontier settlements were exposed to raids, and he lacked the resources, the men, the supplies to protect them all. He spent the next 3 years in frustration, trying to impose discipline on a militia that was poorly paid and equipped, dealing with desertion and insubordination, writing letters to the governor and the legislature begging for support that rarely came. He learned about the difficulties of command, about the gap between orders and execution, about the loneliness of responsibility. He also learned about the limits of his own temper, his impatience with incompetence, his hunger for respect and recognition. It was during these years that he began to develop the qualities that would later define him. Patience born of necessity, a capacity to endure disappointment, an understanding that achievement came slowly and through persistence rather than brilliance or dash. He wanted glory, but he learned to accept the grinding work that preceded it, if it came at all. He wanted the respect of the Virginia gentlemen who directed policy, and he worked to cultivate the bearing and manner that might earn it. He was always conscious of how he appeared, of his reputation, of the impression he made. This consciousness could make him seem vain or overly concerned with honor, but it was also the self-awareness of someone who understood that in his world, perception shaped reality, and that a man without reputation was a man without power. By 1758, the war was shifting in Britain's favor. A new expedition was organized against Fort Duquesne, and Washington participated, eager to be part of a success after so many frustrations. When the British and colonial forces arrived, they found the fort abandoned and burning, the French having withdrawn rather than face overwhelming numbers. It was a victory of sorts, though not the dramatic triumph Washington might have hoped for. Still, it marked the end of the immediate threat to Virginia's frontier, and it allowed him to step back from military service with his reputation intact if not gloriously enhanced. He was tired of military life, tired of the hardships and disappointments, ready to turn his attention to other ambitions. He resigned his commission in December of that year and prepared to begin a different kind of life. He had proven his courage and his commitment, but he had also learned that military glory was uncertain and that the path to security and respectability might lie elsewhere. He turned toward home, toward the plantation that awaited him, toward the prospect of marriage and family, and the life of a Virginia gentleman. In January of 1759, George Washington married Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy widow with 2 young children. She brought to the marriage a substantial fortune, including land, slaves, and money, effectively doubling Washington's wealth and establishing him as one of the more prosperous planters in Virginia. The marriage was practical as much as romantic, a union that served both parties well. Martha needed a husband to help manage her estates and provide stability for her children. George needed the financial security and social position that came with such a marriage. Whether there was deep passion between them is uncertain, but there was respect and companionship, and over time, affection that seemed genuine enough. They settled at Mount Vernon, and Washington set about transforming himself into a successful planter and landowner. He expanded the house, improved the farms, experimented with crops and techniques, kept meticulous records of every expense and every harvest. He was methodical and ambitious, always seeking to increase efficiency and profit, always comparing his results to those of his neighbors. He grew tobacco at first, as all Virginia planters did, but he found it unpredictable and exhausting to the soil. He gradually shifted toward wheat and other grains, diversifying his operations, building mills, trying to create a more self-sufficient and sustainable enterprise. He served in the Virginia House of Burgesses, the colonial legislature, representing his county and participating in the slow workings of governance. He was not a great speaker, rarely rising to address the assembly, more comfortable in committees and private conversations than in public debate. He listened more than he spoke, watched more than he acted, but he was present, attentive, learning how decisions were made and power was distributed. He cultivated relationships with other prominent Virginians, attending balls and dinners, hosting guests at Mount Vernon, performing the social rituals that bound the planter class together. The years passed quietly, marked by the rhythms of planting and harvest, by the small dramas of plantation management, by the routines of family life. Martha's children, Jackie and Patsy, became his stepchildren, and he was attentive to them, particularly to Patsy, who suffered from epilepsy and required constant care. He ordered toys and clothes for them from England, worried over their education and health, played the role of father though he had no biological children of his own. Whether the lack of his own children troubled him deeply is uncertain, but he channeled his paternal instincts into his stepchildren and, later, into other young relatives and into the soldiers he would command. The empire to which Virginia belonged was changing in ways that would eventually force Washington out of his quiet prosperity. Britain had won the Great War against France, gaining Canada and vast territories in the interior, but the victory came with enormous debts and new challenges of administration. The British government decided that the American colonies should contribute more to their own defense and to the costs of empire. New taxes were imposed, new regulations enacted, new assertions of authority made. To the colonists, these measures seemed not like reasonable adjustments, but like violations of their rights as Englishmen, intrusions on liberties they had long enjoyed. Washington watched these developments with growing concern. He was not a radical, not a man given to passionate rhetoric or dramatic gestures. He valued order and stability, and he believed in the empire of which he was a part. But he also believed in certain rights, certain principles of self-governance that seemed to him fundamental. When the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act in 1765, taxing legal documents and printed materials, he joined other Virginians in opposition, though quietly, through proper channels. When the act was repealed, he felt vindicated. When new taxes followed, his unease grew. He was not a man of eloquence or deep political philosophy. He did not write pamphlets or deliver stirring speeches, but he understood injustice when he felt it, particularly economic injustice that touched his own interests. The British merchants to whom he sold his tobacco and from whom he bought manufactured goods seemed always to have the advantage, setting prices that favored them, extending credit that trapped him in debt, treating the colonial planters as subordinates rather than equals. The imperial trade regulations that required colonial goods to pass through British ports, to be carried on British ships, to enrich British middlemen, began to feel less like the natural order of things and more like a system designed to keep Virginia and the other colonies in permanent dependence. By the early 1770s, the relationship between the colonies and the mother country had deteriorated significantly. The Boston Tea Party in 1773, an act of defiance against the tea tax, provoked the British government to impose what the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, punishing Massachusetts and asserting parliamentary authority in ways that alarmed leaders throughout the colonies. If Parliament could close Boston's port, if it could alter Massachusetts' charter, what might it do to Virginia or any other colony that resisted its will? In 1774, the Virginia House of Burgesses responded to these provocations by calling for a day of fasting and prayer in solidarity with Boston. The royal governor dissolved the assembly, but the members reconvened informally and called for a Continental Congress, a gathering of delegates from all the colonies to coordinate a response to British policies. Washington was chosen as one of Virginia's delegates, an acknowledgement of his standing in the colony, his reputation for steadiness and judgment, his known commitment to American rights. He traveled to Philadelphia in September of 1774, joining delegates from 12 colonies in a remarkable assembly. These were men who had never worked together before, who represented colonies with different economies and interests and temperaments, who were feeling their way towards some form of united action without knowing quite what that would mean or where it would lead. Washington said little during the sessions of the First Continental Congress, but he was noticed. He wore his old military uniform, a signal of his willingness to fight if necessary, a reminder that Virginia had men of military experience who might lead resistance if resistance became unavoidable. The Congress produced a Declaration of Rights, a call for boycotts of British goods, and a plan to reconvene if Britain did not address colonial grievances. Washington returned to Mount Vernon hoping that reconciliation might still be possible, but not believing it likely. He began to train the local militia, to read military treatises, to prepare himself for a conflict that seemed increasingly inevitable. When news reached Virginia in April of 1775 that fighting had broken out in Massachusetts, at Lexington and Concord, the abstract possibility of war became sudden reality. Blood had been shed. British soldiers and colonial militia had killed each other. The situation had crossed a threshold from which there might be no return. The Second Continental Congress convened in May, and Washington was again among Virginia's delegates. The atmosphere was different now, urgent and uncertain. An army of militia had gathered around Boston, besieging the British forces there, and the Congress had to decide whether to support them, to assume responsibility for this armed resistance. The question of who might command such an army arose quickly. There were men with military experience from various colonies, but the need was for someone who could unite the colonies, who could command respect in both New England and the South, who had the character and bearing to lead a cause that was beginning to feel revolutionary. John Adams of Massachusetts, recognizing the political necessity of binding the colonies together, proposed George Washington of Virginia. It was a strategic choice as much as a military one. Washington was from the largest and most populous of the southern colonies, and his appointment would ensure that the conflict would not be seen as merely a New England affair. He had military experience, though not as much as some others. He had demonstrated courage and had learned from his failures. He was wealthy enough to be above suspicion of seeking the position for financial gain. He had gravitas, dignity, a physical presence that suggested leadership. He was tall, over 6 feet, unusual for the time, and powerfully built, with large hands and a bearing that commanded attention without requiring words. Washington did not seek the position. When it was offered, he accepted with what appeared to be genuine reluctance, expressing doubts about his own abilities and the magnitude of the task. Whether this was false modesty or sincere anxiety is difficult to say. Perhaps it was both. He understood what he was taking on, the responsibility for an army that barely existed, for a cause that could end in triumph or in the hangman's noose for all who led it. He refused a salary, asking only that Congress cover his expenses. This gesture of selflessness enhanced his reputation and established a pattern he would maintain, of serving without apparent personal ambition, of subordinating himself to the cause he led. In June of 1775, he left Philadelphia for Cambridge, Massachusetts, to take command of what was being called the Continental Army. He rode north with a mixture of determination and apprehension, knowing that everything he had built, his reputation, his estate, his family's security, was now at risk. If the rebellion failed, he would be remembered as a traitor, his property confiscated, his name disgraced. If it succeeded, the outcome was so uncertain, so unprecedented, that he could not begin to imagine what it would mean. When he arrived at Cambridge, he found not an army but a gathering of militia from various colonies. Perhaps 15,000 men camped in and around the town, besieging the British forces in Boston. They were brave and committed, but they lacked discipline, training, organization, supplies. Many had elected their own officers. Some came and went as they pleased. They were farmers and tradesmen playing at being soldiers, and Washington looked at them with a mixture of hope and dismay. He had to transform this assembly into a fighting force capable of standing against the most powerful military in the world. He set about the task with characteristic thoroughness. He imposed discipline, drilling the men, insisting on military hierarchy and obedience, court-martialing those who defied orders. He worked to standardize equipment and training. He struggled with shortages of everything: gunpowder, weapons, tents, clothing, food. He wrote endless letters to Congress begging for supplies and support, trying to make distant politicians understand the realities of his situation. He dealt with rivalries between officers from different colonies, with resentment over appointments and ranks, with the constant turnover as militia enlistments expired and men went home to their farms. The siege of Boston continued through the fall and winter of 1775 and into 1776. It was a strange, static confrontation, the two armies watching each other across fortifications, neither able or willing to force a decisive battle. Washington chafed at the inaction but lacked the resources to attack. Then, in early March, he seized Dorchester Heights, the high ground south of Boston, and fortified it with cannon that had been dragged overland from Fort Ticonderoga in New York. The British commander, General Howe, recognized that his position had become untenable. Rather than assault the heights, he evacuated Boston, sailing with his army to Halifax, leaving the city to the Americans. It was Washington's first clear victory, achieved with minimal bloodshed, and it confirmed Congress's faith in his leadership. But he knew the British would return, and that when they did, they would come in far greater strength. He moved his army to New York, the most strategically important city on the continent, the key to controlling the Hudson River and the route between New England and the southern colonies. If the British took New York, they could split the colonies in two, isolating New England and potentially crushing the rebellion piece by piece. While Washington prepared defenses in New York, the Continental Congress in Philadelphia was moving toward a decision that would change everything. In July of 1776, they adopted the Declaration of Independence, a document that transformed the conflict from a dispute over rights within the British Empire into a war for complete separation and the creation of a new nation. Washington heard the news and had the declaration read aloud to his troops, and he understood that there was no turning back now. This was no longer about reform or negotiation. This was about independence or annihilation. The British came to New York in the summer of 1776 with overwhelming force. Hundreds of ships, tens of thousands of soldiers, the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever assembled. General Howe commanded the land forces, and his brother, Admiral Howe, commanded the fleet. They had been sent to crush the rebellion, and they had the means to do it. Washington had fewer than 20,000 men, many of them inexperienced, and he was trying to defend an indefensible position. New York was a series of islands and peninsulas, surrounded by water that the British Navy controlled. He should have abandoned the city, but Congress wanted it defended, and he was reluctant to surrender such an important position without a fight. The Battle of Long Island in August was a disaster. The British outflanked Washington's positions, routing his forces and nearly capturing him and his entire army. Only a miraculous nighttime evacuation across the East River to Manhattan saved them. It was a retreat, but it was also a brilliant tactical maneuver, conducted in silence and darkness, ferried by Massachusetts fishermen who knew the waters, completed just before dawn and British discovery. Washington had escaped, but he had lost a battle and left behind prisoners and supplies. The pattern repeated over the following months. The British landed at Kip's Bay on Manhattan, and American militia broke and ran. Washington raged at them, even struck fleeing soldiers with his cane, humiliated by their collapse. He fought a better battle at Harlem Heights, a small victory that restored some confidence, but the strategic situation was hopeless. He withdrew north, out of Manhattan, into Westchester. The British pursued, but without the urgency that might have ended the war. Howe was cautious, unwilling to risk his army in aggressive action, hoping perhaps that the rebellion would simply collapse under pressure. Washington retreated across New Jersey through the fall of 1776, the British following, taking towns and accepting the surrender of Americans who saw the cause as lost. Enlistments were expiring, men were going home, supplies were running out. Washington's army shrank to a few thousand cold, hungry, exhausted men. He crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania in early December, and the British stopped their pursuit, settling into winter quarters, confident that the rebellion was all but finished. General Howe returned to the comforts of New York, leaving garrisons at Trenton and other towns in New Jersey. It was the low point of the war and of Washington's command. His army was disintegrating. The cause seemed hopeless. In a few weeks, most of the remaining enlistments would expire, and there would be no army at all. He sat in his headquarters, writing letters, pondering options that all seemed bleak. He needed a victory, something to revive the cause and convince his men to stay, to convince Congress and the states that the fight was not over. On Christmas night, 1776, he made a decision born of desperation and audacity. He would cross back over the Delaware, attack the Hessian garrison at Trenton, and strike a blow that might change the psychological momentum of the war. It was an enormous risk. The crossing would be difficult, through ice-choked waters on a freezing night. If discovered, his small force could be destroyed. If he failed, the war would likely end. He divided his army into 3 columns, each to cross at a different point, but only his own column managed the crossing. The night was brutal, sleet and snow, and the crossing took longer than planned. They were supposed to attack before dawn, but it was nearly 8 in the morning by the time they reached Trenton. The Hessians, sleeping off their Christmas celebrations, were taken completely by surprise. The attack was swift and decisive. The Hessians surrendered, nearly 1,000 prisoners taken, with minimal American casualties. Washington had his victory. He recrossed the river with his prisoners and then, days later, crossed again, reoccupying Trenton and positioning himself to face the British response. General Cornwallis marched from Princeton with a superior force to trap Washington against the river. They faced each other across a creek on January 2, 1777, and Cornwallis prepared to attack the next morning, confident he would finish Washington then. But during the night, Washington slipped away, leaving his campfires burning, marching his army along back roads toward Princeton. He attacked the British garrison there at dawn, fought a sharp battle in which he personally rallied his troops within range of enemy muskets, and won another victory before withdrawing north to the hills around Morristown. The twin victories at Trenton and Princeton transformed the war. They did not change the strategic balance of forces. The British still had far more men and resources, but they changed the perception of the war. They showed that the Continental Army could fight and win. They revived American morale and convinced many soldiers to re-enlist. They made Washington's reputation as a general and as a leader who would not give up even in the darkest circumstances. and they gave the British reason to doubt that the rebellion could be easily crushed. Washington settled his army into winter quarters at Morristown, and through the early months of 1777, he rebuilt and reorganized. It was painstaking work, dealing with Congress's inability to provide adequate supplies, training new recruits, enforcing discipline, planning for the next campaign. He knew the British would come again, probably with a strategy to divide the colonies by taking control of the Hudson River Valley. He tried to anticipate their moves, to position his forces to counter them, to keep the army intact as the central symbol and instrument of resistance. The British campaign of 1777 unfolded in ways Washington did not fully anticipate. General Bergen led an army south from Canada, intending to take Albany and split New England from the other colonies. But instead of marching north to meet Bergen, General Howe took his army by sea to Chesapeake Bay and marched on Philadelphia, the American capital. Washington moved to block him, fighting at Brandywine Creek in September, but was outmaneuvered and defeated. He fought again at Germantown in October, a complex battle that came close to success but ultimately failed. The British took Philadelphia and Congress fled. It seemed like another series of defeats, another demonstration that Washington could not beat the British in open battle. But while Howe occupied Philadelphia, Bergen's army was being surrounded in upstate New York by American forces under Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold. Cut off from support, harassed by militia, running out of supplies, Bergen surrendered his entire army at Saratoga in October. It was a stunning American victory, and it had enormous consequences. France, which had been watching the conflict and secretly providing aid, now saw the Americans as viable allies. In early 1778, France formally recognized American independence and entered into an alliance, providing military support, naval power, and legitimacy to the revolutionary cause. The war was no longer just a colonial rebellion. It was an international conflict in which Britain faced multiple enemies. Washington took his army into winter quarters at Valley Forge in December of 1777, and there they endured months of extraordinary hardship. The winter was brutal. Supplies were nearly non-existent. Congress seemed unable or unwilling to provide what the army needed. Men lived in rough huts, many without proper clothing or shoes, leaving bloody footprints in the snow. They survived on inadequate rations, on whatever could be foraged or seized from the surrounding countryside. Disease spread through the camp: typhus, typhoid, dysentery, pneumonia. Thousands died, not in battle but from cold and hunger and sickness. Washington shared their suffering, living simply, eating little better than his men, walking among them, trying to maintain their spirits and his own. He wrote furious letters to Congress and to the states, demanding supplies, threatening resignation, pleading for the support that the army needed to survive. He dealt with conspiracies against his command, with officers who whispered that he should be replaced by Gates or some other general who had achieved clearer victories. He endured the criticism and the doubt and held on, knowing that if the army dissolved, the cause would die with it. Something remarkable happened that winter at Valley Forge. The army that emerged in the spring of 1778 was different from the one that had entered. A Prussian officer, Baron von Steuben, arrived and set about training the troops in European military drill and tactics, imposing a standardization and professionalism that had been lacking. The soldiers, having survived the winter together, had forged a bond, a collective identity as the Continental Army. They had not broken, and their endurance had become its own kind of victory. Washington had held them together through will and presence and the force of his example, and they emerged harder, more disciplined, more capable. The war entered a new phase with French involvement. The British, facing enemies on multiple fronts, began to shift their strategy, concentrating forces, abandoning Philadelphia in June of 1778 and marching back to New York. Washington pursued and attacked the British column at Monmouth in New Jersey. The battle was inconclusive, but Washington's army fought well, standing toe-to-toe with British regulars in the brutal heat of a June day. It was the last major battle in the North for several years, as the war moved south and became a different kind of conflict. From 1778 to 1780, Washington's main army remained in the vicinity of New York, watching the British but not engaging in major operations. It was a period of frustration, of waiting, of small skirmishes and raids but no decisive action. The British held New York City and its environs. The Americans controlled the surrounding territory, and neither side could dislodge the other. Washington wanted to attack New York to drive the British out, but he lacked the resources. The French fleet came and went, cooperating imperfectly with American forces, hampered by poor coordination and the difficulties of combined operations. The war in the South became increasingly bitter and brutal. The British captured Savannah in 1778 and Charleston in 1780, taking thousands of prisoners and seemingly establishing control over Georgia and South Carolina. American forces in the South suffered defeat after defeat. Guerrilla warfare erupted, with irregular forces on both sides committing atrocities. Loyalists and patriots fought each other with the viciousness of civil war, which in many ways it was. Communities were divided, families torn apart, old scores settled with violence. Washington sent some of his best troops south to reinforce American forces there. But he could not go himself, could not leave the main army, could not abandon the watch on New York. He relied on other commanders, Gates, who was badly defeated at Camden, Nathanael Greene, who took command in the South in 1780 and began a brilliant campaign of maneuver and attrition that gradually wore down British strength. Washington coordinated as best he could from a distance, offering advice and support, trusting in the abilities of his subordinates, managing the complex politics of Congress and the French alliance, trying to hold together a war effort that was always on the edge of collapse. The darkest moment came in September of 1780, when Benedict Arnold, one of Washington's most talented and trusted generals, was revealed to be a traitor who had been plotting to surrender West Point to the British. The discovery was a shock that shook Washington deeply. Arnold had been a hero, had fought bravely at Saratoga and elsewhere, and his betrayal felt personal. If Arnold could turn traitor, who else might? The revelation deepened Washington's natural caution and reserve, reinforced his sense that trust had to be earned and constantly proven. The army remained underpaid, undersupplied, and increasingly mutinous. Soldiers had not been paid in months, sometimes years. Their enlistments had been extended without their consent. Their families at home were suffering. In January of 1781, Pennsylvania troops mutinied, killing officers and marching toward Philadelphia to demand redress from Congress. Washington faced a crisis of authority. He sent negotiators and managed to resolve the mutiny without widespread bloodshed, but it was a near thing. New Jersey troops mutinied soon after, and this time Washington responded with force, executing the ringleaders. It was harsh but necessary, a message that discipline had to be maintained even as he sympathized with the soldiers' grievances. Through all of this, Washington kept writing letters, pleading with Congress, with state governors, with anyone who might provide money or supplies or men. He kept the army together not through the promise of victory, but through sheer determination and the force of his own commitment. He had become the indispensable figure of the Revolution, not because he was a brilliant strategist or a charismatic leader in the traditional sense, but because he would not quit, because he absorbed disappointment and frustration and kept going, because his presence itself was a form of leadership. In the spring and summer of 1781, the war finally turned in America's favor, though not in ways Washington had planned. General Cornwallis, commanding British forces in the South, moved into Virginia, chasing American forces and trying to establish a base of operations. He fortified Yorktown, on the peninsula between the York and James rivers, intending to use it as a supply depot and a point from which to receive reinforcements by sea. It was a strong position, but it was also potentially a trap if the sea routes could be cut. Washington saw the opportunity before it fully materialized, sensing it the way a hunter senses the movement of prey through distant brush. Cornwallis at Yorktown was vulnerable if, and it was an enormous if, the French fleet could control the waters around the peninsula and prevent British naval support from reaching him. For years, Washington had dreamed of a combined operation with the French, coordinated perfectly, timed precisely, delivering a blow that might end the war. The possibility now presented itself, fragile and contingent on factors beyond his control, but real nonetheless. He was camped north of New York City with the main Continental Army and a French force under the Comte de Rochambeau. Together, they had perhaps 10,000 men, not enough to take New York from the strong British garrison there. Washington still wanted to attack the city, still believed that capturing it would be the decisive stroke. But Rochambeau brought news that a French fleet under Admiral de Grasse was sailing to the Chesapeake and would be available for operations in late summer. If they moved quickly, if they could march south without the British discovering their true intent until too late, if de Grasse could hold the bay, if Cornwallis remained at Yorktown, then perhaps they could trap him. It required deception and speed and luck. Washington ordered elaborate preparations for an attack on New York, building camps and ovens, spreading rumors, hoping to fix the British in place. Then, in mid-August, he began moving the Allied army south, crossing the Hudson River and marching through New Jersey. The British commander in New York, General Clinton, realized too late what was happening. By the time he understood that Washington was marching toward Virginia, the Allied army was too far ahead to catch. Washington rode south with a growing sense of possibility tempered by anxiety. So much could go wrong. De Grasse might not arrive, or might be defeated by the British fleet, or might decide he could not stay long enough to see the operation through. Cornwallis might retreat before the trap could be sprung. The march itself was an immense logistical undertaking, moving thousands of men hundreds of miles, coordinating with French forces, managing supplies and transportation. And even if everything came together, they would still have to besiege and defeat a well-fortified British army. He passed through his home state of Virginia for the first time in more than 6 years. He stopped at Mount Vernon briefly, just long enough to see Martha and the estate he had left behind, a fleeting reminder of the life that awaited him if the war ever ended. Then he moved on, drawn by the necessity of the moment, the pull of duty that had governed his life for so long. By late September, the pieces had fallen into place with astonishing precision. De Grasse arrived in the Chesapeake with his fleet and defeated a British naval force in a battle that cleared the bay. Cornwallis was cut off from seaborne support or escape. Washington's and Rochambeau's armies arrived and began to surround Yorktown. Additional American forces under Lafayette, who had been shadowing Cornwallis through Virginia, joined the siege. In all, there were perhaps 16,000 Allied troops against 8,000 British, and the British had nowhere to go. The siege followed the formal patterns of 18th-century warfare. Trenches were dug, zigzagging closer to the British fortifications. Artillery was brought forward, positioned, aimed. Bombardment began day and night, the cannon fire methodical and relentless, smashing British defenses, killing soldiers, destroying supplies, making the British position untenable. Washington himself fired the first American gun, a symbolic act that placed him at the center of the operation. He watched the siege unfold with a mixture of hope and nervous energy, knowing that this might be the culmination of everything, the moment that justified all the suffering and sacrifice. On the night of October 14, American and French forces stormed 2 key British redoubts in coordinated bayonet attacks. Alexander Hamilton, Washington's former aide and now a field commander, led one assault. The positions were taken in fierce hand-to-hand fighting. The noose tightened. Cornwallis attempted a desperate escape across the York River but was thwarted by bad weather. He had no options left. On October 17, 1781, a British drummer appeared on the parapet, beating the signal for parley. The sound cut through the morning air, and men on both sides paused, understanding what it meant. 2 days later, on October 19, the British Army marched out of Yorktown to surrender. They came in formation, their colors cased, their weapons stacked, while a British band played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down," a title that seemed to capture the impossible strangeness of what was happening. An army of the world's greatest empire was surrendering to a collection of colonial rebels and their French allies. Cornwallis claimed illness and did not attend the ceremony himself, sending a subordinate to offer his sword. Washington, in a gesture that mirrored the British general's absence, directed that his own subordinate, General Benjamin Lincoln, receive the surrender. It was a moment of dignity and restraint, Washington refusing to gloat, maintaining the formality that defined his sense of how such things should be conducted. But he felt the triumph, felt it in the presence of his officers, in the faces of the soldiers who had endured so much, in the knowledge that this might truly be the end. Yorktown did not immediately end the war. The British still held New York and Charleston and other positions. Fighting continued in some theaters, but Yorktown broke the British will to continue the conflict. News of the surrender reached London and brought down the government that had prosecuted the war. New ministers came to power prepared to negotiate peace. The war would drag on for another year and a half before a formal treaty was signed, but the decisive military outcome had been achieved. Washington took the main army back north to watch the British in New York and to wait. It was a strange period, suspended between war and peace, the army still in existence but with little to do, the soldiers growing more restive as the months passed, and they remained unpaid and unrewarded for their service. Washington worried about what they might do, how their frustrations might boil over into something destructive. He worried too about what would come next, what kind of nation would emerge from this conflict, whether the states would hold together or fragment into rivalries and disorder. In the spring of 1783, a crisis emerged that tested Washington's relationship with his army and his own sense of duty and restraint. Officers in the army, angry about unpaid wages and broken promises of pensions, began to circulate anonymous letters suggesting that the army should refuse to disband until Congress met their demands. Some went further, hinting that the army might march on Congress, might seize power, might install Washington as some form of dictator or king if civilian authorities would not act responsibly. It was the shadow of military coup, the possibility that the revolution might end not in the establishment of Republican government, but in the rule of the sword. Washington was horrified by the suggestion. He called a meeting of his officers at Newburgh, New York, in March of 1783, and addressed them directly. He spoke of his own service, of his faith in Congress and the civilian authorities, of the dangers of the path some were proposing. His words were earnest but not particularly eloquent. Then, preparing to read a letter from a congressman, he paused and took out a pair of spectacles, which few of his officers had seen him wear. "Gentlemen," he said, "You will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray but almost blind in the service of my country." It was a simple, unplanned statement, but it broke the tension in the room. These hardened men who had followed him through years of war saw in that moment the personal cost he had borne, the sacrifice he had made. The conspiracy collapsed. The officers agreed to trust in Congress and the peace process. The Treaty of Paris was signed in September of 1783, formally ending the war and recognizing American independence. The British agreed to withdraw their forces from American territory. The new nation's boundaries were established, stretching from the Atlantic to the Mississippi, from the Great Lakes to Florida. It was an enormous territory, far larger than the original 13 colonies, a continental domain that offered possibilities no one could fully imagine. In November, the British evacuated New York City, and Washington led his army in to reclaim it. He said farewell to his officers at Fraunce's Tavern in an emotional scene where this reserved man embraced each of them, tears flowing freely, the weight of the years, and the farewells too much for even his formidable self-control. Then he began the journey south, stopping in cities along the way to be honored and celebrated, the symbol of victory and of the new nation. He appeared before Congress at Annapolis in December and formally resigned his commission, an act that echoed the Roman general Cincinnatus, who left his plow to save the Republic and then returned to his farm rather than seize power. Washington's resignation was a powerful statement that military power would be subordinate to civilian authority, that the war had been fought for principles larger than personal ambition. It was perhaps his greatest contribution to the American experiment, this voluntary relinquishment of power, this demonstration that Republican virtue could be real and not merely rhetorical. He returned to Mount Vernon on Christmas Eve, 1783, hoping to resume the life of a planter and private citizen. He was 51 years old, tired, wanting nothing more than to manage his estate, to be with Martha, to live quietly after 8.5 years of unrelenting responsibility. He threw himself into the work of rebuilding his farms, which had deteriorated during his absence. He expanded the mansion house, adding new wings and rooms, making it grander and more suited to his sense of what his position required. He experimented with crops and farming techniques, corresponded with agricultural societies, tried to make Mount Vernon a model of enlightened agriculture. But he could not fully withdraw from public life. Visitors came constantly, drawn by his fame, wanting to see the hero of the Revolution. He entertained them with courtesy and hospitality, though the financial burden was considerable. He was consulted on matters of policy and governance, his opinion sought by state governments and by Congress. He watched with growing concern as the new nation struggled to function under the Articles of Confederation, which created a weak central government with little power to tax or regulate commerce or enforce its decisions. The states bickered among themselves, imposed tariffs on each other's goods, refused to pay their debts or support the common government. It seemed to Washington that the nation might tear itself apart through disunity and selfishness, that everything the war had been fought for might be lost not through British conquest, but through American failure to govern themselves. By the mid-1780s, calls were growing for a convention to revise the Articles of Confederation, to create a stronger framework for national government. Washington was reluctant to become involved. He had retired from public life, had given his word that he sought no further role. But he was also deeply worried about the nation's future, and he knew that any convention would need the prestige of his participation to succeed. When Virginia selected him as a delegate to the Constitutional Convention that would meet in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, he accepted with great reluctance, feeling duty calling him once more. The convention met from May to September of 1787, behind closed doors, in the same city where independence had been declared 11 years earlier. 55 delegates from 12 states attended at various times, representing a remarkable collection of talent and experience. Washington was elected president of the convention, a largely ceremonial role, but one that gave the proceedings gravitas and legitimacy. He sat at the front of the room, presiding over debates, saying little himself, but lending by his presence a sense of purpose and importance to the work. The debates were intense, often divisive. Large states and small states argued over representation. Northern states and southern states clashed over slavery and commerce. Those who wanted a strong national government faced those who feared centralized power. Compromises were crafted, sometimes brilliant, sometimes merely expedient. But slowly, a document emerged that created a new form of government, a federal system, with powers divided between national and state authorities, with checks and balances among executive, legislative, and judicial branches. With a chief executive called the president who would be elected indirectly and given substantial but limited powers. Washington believed in the Constitution that emerged from the convention, though he recognized its imperfections. He thought it offered the best hope for holding the nation together, for creating a government capable of acting decisively while still protecting liberty. He lent his support to its ratification, writing letters, allowing his name to be used by those advocating for its adoption. His endorsement mattered enormously. Many Americans trusted Washington more than they trusted abstract arguments about government structure, and his support helped secure ratification in key states. As the Constitution was being debated and ratified in 1787 and 1788, everyone understood that if it was adopted, George Washington would be the first president. He was the only figure with the stature and trust to launch the new government. He did not want the position. He was approaching 60, feeling his age, longing for the peace of Mount Vernon. He worried about the precedents he would set, the mistakes he might make, the ways he might fail to meet expectations. But he also recognized that refusing would be seen as a lack of confidence in the Constitution, and that his refusal might doom the entire experiment. The Constitution was ratified. The first federal elections were held. Washington was elected unanimously by the Electoral College, the only president who would ever receive every electoral vote. He learned of his election in April of 1789 and prepared himself once more to leave home and take up the burden of leadership. He traveled north to New York, which would serve as the temporary capital, greeted along the way by crowds and celebrations that both honored and overwhelmed him. He was not a man who enjoyed adulation, and the spectacle made him uncomfortable, but he understood it was meant for the office and the nation as much as for him personally. He was inaugurated on April 30, 1789, on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York, taking the oath of office with his hand on a Bible, speaking briefly about his sense of duty and his hope for the nation's future. He was dressed in a simple brown suit of American manufacture, a deliberate choice to demonstrate his support for American industry. At 57, he was beginning the task of creating a presidency that did not yet exist, of defining a role that had no clear precedent, of turning words on paper into a functioning government. Everything he did would set a precedent. How should the president be addressed? Some wanted titles like His Excellency or His Highness, but Washington preferred the simple Mr. President. How should the president interact with Congress? He established the practice of delivering messages to them, of consulting with them but maintaining executive independence. How should the president conduct foreign policy? He insisted on the executive's primacy in this sphere, while recognizing the Senate's role in treaties. How should the president relate to the public? He held formal receptions, maintained dignity and distance, tried to be accessible without being common. He assembled a cabinet of extraordinary talent and conflicting visions. Thomas Jefferson became Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Knox Secretary of War, Edmund Randolph Attorney General. Jefferson and Hamilton would emerge as the poles of political disagreement in the new government. Jefferson favoring limited federal power and an agrarian vision of America. Hamilton advocating for strong central authority and commercial development. Washington tried to balance between them, to use their talents while preventing their disagreements from tearing the government apart. Hamilton's financial program was the first great domestic challenge. The nation was deeply in debt from the war, its credit ruined, its finances chaotic. Hamilton proposed that the federal government assume the state's war debts, creating a consolidated national debt that would bind the states to the Union and establish the government's creditworthiness. He proposed creating a national bank to manage finances and facilitate commerce. He proposed taxes, including an excise tax on whiskey, to fund the government. Jefferson and his allies opposed much of this, seeing it as unconstitutional overreach and a betrayal of the agrarian, decentralized republic they thought they had created. Washington, who was not an economic theorist and found much of Hamilton's reasoning difficult to follow, nevertheless supported the program. He believed the nation needed a sound financial foundation, needed to pay its debts and establish its credit. He used his influence to broker compromises, including the famous deal that placed the permanent capital on the Potomac River in exchange for Southern support for Hamilton's Assumption Plan. The Bank of the United States was chartered despite Jefferson's constitutional objections. The financial system began to take shape, and the nation's credit improved. Foreign policy presented even more complex challenges. The French Revolution began in 1789, the same year Washington became president, and it would dominate international relations throughout his presidency. At first, many Americans celebrated the French Revolution as an extension of their own struggle for liberty. But as it became more radical, more violent, descending into terror and war, American opinion divided sharply. Jefferson and his supporters sympathized with France and saw Britain as the greater threat to American interests. Hamilton and his supporters feared French radicalism and believed America's commercial future depended on good relations with Britain. When France and Britain went to war in 1793, both sides expected American support based on their own reasoning. France pointed to the alliance of 1778, when French aid had been crucial to American independence. Britain pointed to commercial ties and cultural connections. Washington proclaimed American neutrality, refusing to be drawn into a European war that served no American interest. It was a controversial decision that angered both sides but maintained American independence and avoided a potentially catastrophic conflict. The Neutrality Proclamation was challenged by Edmond Charles Jenner, the new French minister to the United States, who arrived in 1793 and began commissioning American ships as privateers against British vessels, openly violating American neutrality and appealing to the American public over the head of the government. Washington demanded his recall, asserting the government's authority over foreign policy despite public sympathy for France. It was a crucial assertion of executive power and national sovereignty. Relations with Britain remained tense throughout Washington's first term. The British had not fully evacuated frontier forts as required by the peace treaty. They were suspected of encouraging Indian resistance to American expansion in the Northwest Territory. They seized American ships trading with the French West Indies, impressing American sailors into the Royal Navy. War seemed possible, even likely. Washington sent John Jay to London to negotiate, hoping to avoid conflict while securing American interests. Jay's treaty, signed in 1794, was a disappointment to many Americans. It secured British evacuation of the frontier forts and established commercial arrangements, but it failed to address impressment or secure compensation for slaves carried away during the Revolutionary War. When its terms became public, there were protests and denunciations. Jefferson's supporters saw it as a betrayal, a prostration before Britain. But Washington believed it preserved peace and gained time for the young nation to grow stronger. He submitted it to the Senate, which narrowly ratified it, and he signed it despite the political costs. The treaty fight marked the emergence of organized political opposition, of what would become the first party system. Jefferson's supporters began to coalesce as Democratic Republicans, advocating for states' rights, strict constitutional interpretation, sympathy for France, and agrarian interests. Hamilton's supporters became Federalists, favoring strong national government, loose constitutional interpretation, ties to Britain, and commercial development. Washington deplored the development of parties, seeing them as divisive and dangerous to national unity, but he could not prevent their emergence. Politics was becoming partisan, and his own administration was a battleground. Domestic unrest tested federal authority in 1794 when farmers in western Pennsylvania resisted the whiskey tax, which fell heavily on their principal product and means of exchange. The resistance escalated into violence, with tax collectors tarred and feathered, government officials threatened, courts prevented from functioning. It was a direct challenge to the government's authority, and Washington responded decisively. He called out militia from several states, assembling a force of nearly 13,000 men, and he rode out at their head, the only sitting president to personally lead troops in the field. The show of force was sufficient. The resistance collapsed without significant bloodshed, and federal authority was established. The Whiskey Rebellion demonstrated that the new government could and would enforce its laws, but it also deepened the divide between the government and many Western settlers who felt themselves unfairly taxed and poorly represented. Washington's dealings with Native American nations were guided by a mixture of paternalism, pragmatism, and the inexorable logic of expansion. He believed that Indians should be treated fairly, that treaties should be honored, that violence should be avoided when possible. But he also believed that American expansion was inevitable and right, that Indians must either assimilate to American ways or move westward. He pursued a dual policy of treaty-making and military action, trying to establish peaceful boundaries while being prepared to fight those who resisted. In the Northwest Territory, Confederation of tribes led by Little Turtle and Blue Jacket had defeated American forces in the early 1790s, inflicting catastrophic losses. Washington sent General Anthony Wayne with a trained force that defeated the Tribal Confederation at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, opening much of the Ohio country to American settlement. The Treaty of Greenville followed, in which tribes ceded vast territories in exchange for promises of peace and annuities, promises that would be broken as American hunger for land proved insatiable. Through all of this, Washington maintained the grueling routine of the presidency. He rose early, dealt with correspondence that never ceased, met with cabinet members and legislators and foreign ministers, attended to the endless details of administration. He suffered from various ailments, headaches, fevers, dental problems that plagued him throughout his adult life and left him with ill-fitting dentures that caused constant discomfort and affected his appearance and speech. He felt the weight of office pressing on him, the sense that every decision might have far-reaching consequences, that he was establishing patterns that would endure long after he was gone. He did not enjoy being president. The work was exhausting, the criticism painful, the sense of being constantly watched and judged oppressive to a man who valued his privacy and dignity. He had no taste for partisan politics, no gift for the give and take of democratic debate. He preferred clarity and hierarchy, situations where duty was obvious and could be pursued without the messy compromises of competing interests. The presidency required him to navigate constantly between factions, to balance, to temporize, to accept outcomes that satisfied no one completely. It wore on him. After his first term, he wanted to retire. He had served, had done his duty, had established the government on a functioning basis. He was 64, old by the standards of the time, tired, missing Mount Vernon, ready to go home. But his advisors and supporters pleaded with him to serve a second term. The government was still fragile, the political divisions growing sharper, the international situation dangerous. They argued that only he could hold things together, that his departure would invite chaos or even dissolution of the Union. Reluctantly, he agreed to serve again, elected unanimously once more in 1792.